I need to tell you something that took me 35 years of teaching Catholic theology to actually understand, and I only understood it because I watched it happen in my own living room. 3 years before I lost Margaret. She said the words. I heard her say them. I forgive you. Clear as anything, standing in the kitchen after an argument that honestly wasn't even about anything important anymore. It was about something old, something from years before that had just resurfaced the way old wounds do. She said the words, and then she turned back to the stove, and her shoulders didn't move the way they used to when she was actually at peace. They stayed up, tight, like a fist that forgot to open. I didn't say anything. I filed it away the way you file away 100 small moments in 38 years of marriage. It wasn't until I started reading Padre Pio's actual letters, not the summaries, not the holy card quotes, the actual correspondence, that I found a sentence that stopped me cold and sent me straight back to that kitchen in my memory. He wrote to a woman under his spiritual direction that the mouth can absolve a debt while the heart continues to collect on it. Read that again. The mouth can absolve a debt while the heart continues to collect on it. That is not a metaphor to Padre Pio. That is a diagnosis. And here is what I think none of us wants to admit sitting here tonight, wherever you're watching this. Forgiveness that lives only in the words you said out loud and never reaches the body does not disappear. It goes somewhere. It goes into the flinch when he reaches for your hand. It goes into the extra half-second of hesitation before you answer him honestly. It goes into a coldness that you have convinced yourself isn't there anymore because you said the sentence. You did the work, didn't you? You said, I forgive you. So why does your body still act like it's still keeping score? Before we go further, I want to ask you to do one small thing. Hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Not because I need the number, because when this channel grows, YouTube tells me there's an audience that wants to hear the parts of Padre Pio's teaching that don't make it into the gift shop pamphlets, the parts that are actually uncomfortable, actually convicting. That's what lets me keep digging through these letters and bringing you what I find. So, if this is helping you see something you hadn't seen before, that's how you tell me to keep going. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because I'm not just talking about you tonight. I'm talking about the person on the other side of that flinch, too. The husband or the wife, whoever it is you've decided you've already forgiven. Because for 35 years, I stood in a classroom and taught forgiveness as an event. A decision, a checkbox. You forgive, you move on. Chapter closed. That's the version approved for the textbook. That's the version that fits neatly into a 40-minute class period before the bell rings. But that is not what I found when I actually sat down with the primary sources. That is not what the Catechism says when you read the actual paragraphs on the Our Father instead of the summary someone wrote about the summary. And it is certainly not what Padre Pio wrote to the people who came to him broken, decade after decade, in that little confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo. Let me take you through what I actually found, because I think by the end of this, you're going to look at your own marriage, or your parents' marriage, or the one you're trying to heal right now, completely differently. Picture San Giovanni Rotondo, a small town up in the mountains of southern Italy, sometime in the 1950s. A line forms outside a confessional before dawn. Sometimes hundreds of people, farmers and widows and soldiers back from the war, standing for hours in the cold stone corridor of a Capuchin friary. They are not there to hear a sermon. They are there because word had spread that the friar behind that wooden screen could see straight through whatever a person said out loud to what that person actually still carried underneath. Padre Pio would sometimes stop a penitent mid-sentence, mid-confession, and name the exact grievance the person had never once spoken aloud, the one buried under 30 years of "I'm fine" and "I've forgiven them." People fainted. People wept in the corridor afterward, not from shame, but from the shock of being finally, completely seen. That is the man whose letters I started reading. Not a folk legend on a holy card. A man whose whole ministry was built on the gap between what people said and what their hearts actually held. Paragraph 2840 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the section dealing directly with the line in the Lord's Prayer that terrifies me more than any exorcism account I've ever read. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. The Catechism calls this clause astonishing. That's the actual word used in the official text. Astonishing. Not comforting. Not simple. Astonishing. Because of what it implies structurally about the human heart. Here's the mechanism, and I want you to follow this closely because it's not what you were taught in Sunday school. The Catechism teaches that this is not a bargain, not a transaction where God says, "You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours." It is a description of how the human heart is actually built. A heart that refuses to open toward another wounded human being cannot, by its own internal architecture, remain open to receive mercy from God at the same time. Not because God is petty and withholds it as punishment, because the heart that stays clenched toward one person stays clenched, period. It doesn't selectively open for God and stay shut for your husband. A fist is a fist. It closes the whole hand. Paragraph 2457, and the paragraphs following it go even further. They describe unforgiveness as something that makes a person's heart impenetrable to the Father's merciful love. Impenetrable. That word again. Not unpleasant, not spiritually inconvenient. Impenetrable. Like a wall, like a door with the hinges rusted shut. So when your body flinches at the exact moment your mouth is saying, "It's fine, I forgave you," that is not a small contradiction. According to the actual doctrine, that flinch might be the only honest part of the whole exchange. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure I should share this part because it hits close to home for me, too. Margaret and I had disagreements in 38 years of marriage, real ones, and I can think of at least one where I said the gracious thing out loud far sooner than my chest actually caught up to it. I taught forgiveness as a doctrine for 35 years, and I still did the exact thing I'm describing to you right now. That's how invisible this pattern is. It doesn't spare theology teachers. Now let's go to the man whose actual letters started this whole investigation for me. Padre Pio himself, writing not about wrath, not about exorcism, but about mercy, which is a side of him people rarely quote. In his spiritual correspondence, Padre Pio wrote that whoever wishes to experience the fullness of God's mercy must learn to forgive exactly as they themselves have been forgiven. On its surface, that sounds like a nice, gentle Sunday sentiment. But sit with the actual structure of that sentence for a second. He is not saying forgiveness earns mercy, like a payment. He is saying forgiveness is the shape mercy takes when it moves through a human being toward another human being. Horizontal forgiveness. You to your husband to you, is described as a mirror of vertical forgiveness. God to the soul. Not a separate transaction. The same motion, running in two directions through the same heart, which means when you refuse to let the horizontal motion complete, when the forgiveness stops at your lips and never reaches your ribs, you are not just withholding something from your husband. You are jamming the exact same mechanism that is supposed to let God's mercy move through you. It's the same door. You can't hold it shut on one side and expect it open wide on the other. I keep coming back to something else in that same letter, where Padre Pio describes the soul that clings to old grievances as living, in his words, with a wound that refuses the very medicine offered for it. A wound, refusing its own medicine. Think about the physical image there. You're not talking about a wound that no one has tried to treat. You're talking about a wound where the medicine is right there, offered, and the wound itself is somehow refusing to let it in. Stay with me here. This is where it matters, because now I want to walk you through why this isn't just poetic language from a 1960s Capuchin friar. There is a mechanism underneath this that a priest I heard lecture in 2018, Father Chad Ripperger, laid out in a way that genuinely unsettled me, and it's the reason I started reading Padre Pio's letters in the first place. Father Ripperger teaches, from decades of experience in deliverance ministry, that unresolved trauma and the resentment that accumulates around it function as one of the most common doorways for demonic influence in an otherwise ordinary, faithful life, not possession in the dramatic sense you see in movies. Oppression. A foothold. A door left slightly open in a wall that should be solid. Here's the part that stopped me in my seat at that conference. Ripperger explained that it is specifically the act of releasing the pain and forgiving, both the other person and, just as often, yourself, that allows the Holy Spirit to move into that wound and close it. Not time, not distraction, not it'll fade eventually. The release itself is what closes the door, and if the release never happens, if it stays performed at the level of words while the body keeps the wound sealed shut against healing, the door stays exactly where it was. Open. Waiting. I don't say this lightly because I know how it sounds, but think about what that means for a marriage where one partner has said, "I forgive you," and genuinely believes it, while the body has never actually released the injury. According to this teaching, that is not a closed chapter. That is an open door in the wall of that home, in that marriage, in that person's interior life, sitting there, unaddressed, because everyone involved has already agreed the matter is settled. At that same 2018 conference, Ripperger described, without naming names, protecting the people involved the way any responsible priest would, a pattern he had encountered again and again in deliverance work. A person comes forward struggling with something they cannot explain. Sudden rage that doesn't match the situation in front of them. A crushing heaviness at specific times of day, specific anniversaries, specific rooms in a house. And when the history finally gets traced back far enough, it almost always lands on the same kind of moment. An old wound, technically forgiven years or decades earlier, that the person had simply agreed to stop discussing. Not released, just tabled, filed under closed and never opened again, except by the body, at 3 a.m, on the anniversary nobody else remembers. Ripperger's point was never that every difficult marriage is a case of demonic oppression. His point was narrower and, in some ways, more disturbing. The door left ajar by an unreleased grudge doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. Most of the time it just looks like a marriage where two people are quietly, politely, exhausted with each other, and neither one can say exactly why. Ask yourself honestly, is there a door like that in your own life right now? One you've told everyone, including yourself, is already shut? Now, some of you watching this are going to say, and I understand the instinct, that all of this is just spiritual language dressed up around ordinary stress and ordinary biology. That resentment is a psychological state. Cortisol is cortisol, and there's no soul mechanism required to explain a bad mood that won't go away. I want to take that seriously because it deserves an honest answer, not a dismissal. Here's what the secular research actually shows, and this is the part that surprised me most when I went looking for it. Chronic resentment, the kind that sits in a person for months or years without release, measurably elevates cortisol levels and resting heart rate. Piedmont Healthcare, a major secular medical system, documents this directly. Sustained resentment is associated with worse outcomes in cardiovascular disease, in immune function, in chronic pain, and in sleep quality. This is not a mystical claim. This is blood work. This is a stress hormone that shows up on a lab report. And here's where I think the two worlds, the mystical and the medical, stop contradicting each other and start confirming each other. The Catholic tradition never claimed the natural world and the supernatural world operate in separate, sealed compartments. It teaches they operate together, the natural carrying the fingerprint of the supernatural underneath it. So when medicine tells us independently, with no theological agenda at all, that an unforgiven heart produces measurable physical wear on the body, heart, immune system, sleep, that is not a coincidence competing with the mystics. That is confirmation. The body is keeping the same receipts that Padre Pio said the soul keeps. Different filing system. Same debt. Think about what that actually means in practical terms for someone lying awake at 11 at night next to a spouse they've supposedly already forgiven. The elevated cortisol doesn't punch out at bedtime because the argument is technically over. It stays elevated through the specific physiological pathway researchers can now trace on a monitor. Heart rate slightly higher than it should be for a body at rest, sleep that never quite drops into the deep restorative stage, because some part of the nervous system is still, in a very literal sense, standing guard. Multiply that one night by 3 years, by 10 years, by a marriage that lasted 38, and you are not describing an emotional inconvenience anymore. You are describing a body that has been quietly, chemically bracing itself against a threat it has told itself, in words, no longer exists. Which brings me back to that kitchen again, her shoulders staying tight after she said the words. I used to think that was just Margaret being Margaret, holding tension the way she always did after a long day. Now I read it completely differently. I think her body was telling a truer story than her sentence was. And here's where I have to say something directly, because the title of this video mentions a husband, and I don't want anyone thinking this is a lesson about what wives do and husbands endure. It is not. I have counseled, informally, as a retired teacher people still call on a Sunday afternoon, as many husbands who carried an unspoken grudge against a wife as wives who carried one against a husband. The mechanism does not check for gender. A closed heart closes identically whether it belongs to the one who was hurt first or the one everyone assumes was in the wrong. This is not about assigning blame for who started the argument 20 years ago. It is about a door in a chest that either opens or it doesn't. And it behaves exactly the same way, no matter which spouse it belongs to. Now, I want to address something directly, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking, and I respect the question too much to skip past it. You're thinking, isn't this just forgive and forget, repackaged? Isn't this the same toxic advice that therapists have been warning against for years? The pressure to just move on, stop bringing it up, act like it never happened before you've actually processed what was done to you? That is a real concern, and I want to be precise here, because Catholic teaching is far more careful than the slogan makes it sound. Forgiveness, properly understood, is not amnesia. It is not pretending the wound never happened. It is not skipping the grief or the anger that comes before healing. Forgiveness is a decision of the will, a choice not to wish harm on the other person, not to hold their debt against them anymore. That is a completely different act from reconciliation, which is the slow, sometimes years-long process of rebuilding trust. And it is a completely different act from forgetting, which may never fully happen at all and doesn't need to. You can forgive a wound and still remember clearly that it happened. The Catechism does not ask you to erase your memory. It asks you to open your hand. So if a well-meaning relative told you to just forgive and forget before you'd even finished crying about what happened, that advice failed you. But it failed you by skipping steps. Not because forgiveness itself is the wrong goal. The goal is still right. The timeline was wrong. And the destination was never supposed to be forgetting. It was always supposed to be an open hand whenever you're actually ready to open it. Not before, and not performed for someone else's comfort. I came across a piece from Catholic Exchange while I was researching this that put the same idea into a single line I haven't been able to shake since. The author wrote that we rarely manage to hurt the person who wronged us nearly as much as we end up hurting ourselves by refusing to let go. Read carefully. That is not a guilt trip aimed at the person still in pain. It's an observation about where the weight actually lands. The person who wronged you, in Jenny's case, her husband, in your case, whoever it is, often moves on with far less internal damage than the person carrying the grudge does. Not because it's fair, it isn't, but because a held grudge requires constant maintenance. It has to be fed, rehearsed, kept sharp enough to still hurt on the anniversary, in the argument 3 years later, that suddenly isn't about the dishes anymore. That same article makes a point I think Padre Pio would have recognized immediately. An unreleased grudge doesn't just sit still waiting to be dealt with someday, it actively blocks prayer. It sits between a person and the very grace they're asking God for every night, the same architecture the Catechism describes, just described this time by a magazine writer instead of a mystic, and arriving at the identical conclusion. Let me tell you about a woman named Jenny, whose story I came across while researching this, because I think it captures exactly what I'm describing better than any of my own words could. Jenny's husband had an affair. She found out the way most people find out. Not gently, not on her own terms. And she made a decision, a real one, grounded in love for her son, for the family they had built, for whatever was still alive in the marriage worth saving. She chose to forgive him, not passively, actively. She told him. She meant it in the moment, as much as anyone can mean something that enormous. Years passed, and by her own account, she was still living, in her words, in the shadow of what happened, still monitoring him, still watching for signs, still unable to fully exhale in the marriage she had chosen to stay in. The decision had been made, the sentence had been said, but something had never actually completed. Here's what I want you to notice about Jenny's story, because it's the detail almost everyone misses. The damage in a story like this is never confined to the person doing the monitoring. Her husband, the one who caused the wound in the first place, was also living under that surveillance every single day. Not free either. Both of them locked in the aftermath of a forgiveness that had happened at the level of decision, but never fully arrived at the level of the body. The debt was legally canceled, so to speak, but the collections calls never actually stopped. That is the part nobody talks about. We tend to think unforgiveness only punishes the person still hurt. It doesn't work that way. It leaks. It reaches across the bed, across the kitchen table, across every ordinary evening, and it touches the very person who was supposedly already forgiven. Their heart dries out too, a little more each year, under the weight of a suspicion they can feel, but that no one will name out loud because officially, the matter is closed. What strikes me most about Jenny's account is a small detail she mentioned almost in passing, that she started keeping track, without fully admitting it to herself, of her husband's phone. Not obsessively, not at first. Just a glance here, a question there, framed as casual. He noticed. Of course he noticed. And according to her own telling, he adjusted, became a little more explanatory about his whereabouts than he needed to be, a little quicker to overshare his day, the way a person behaves when they know, without being told, that they are still on trial. Neither of them ever said the word grudge out loud again after the initial forgiveness. They didn't need to. The behavior said it for them. That is what an unreleased debt looks like from the outside. Not shouting, not accusation, just two people quietly adjusting their whole daily rhythm around a wound that everyone agreed on paper had already healed, officially closed, actually open. That gap between what's declared and what's real is exactly where Padre Pio's line lives. The mouth can absolve a debt while the heart continues to collect on it. So let's bring this all the way back down to something practical, because I don't want to leave you with just a diagnosis and no way to actually look at your own life honestly. Here is the small examination of conscience I'd ask you to sit with tonight, alone, without performing the answer for anyone. Think of one person, your spouse most likely, since that's what brought you to this video. But it could be a parent, a sibling, a friend who wounded you, where you have said the words, "I forgive you." Now ask the harder question underneath it. When they reach for you, physically or emotionally, does something in you still pull back before you've even decided to? When their name comes up in conversation, is there still a tightening somewhere in your chest that arrives before your thoughts do? If you're honest, and only you can be honest about this one, in the quiet, does your body still keep a ledger that your mouth has already closed? If the answer is yes, and for most of us, if we're truly honest, the answer is yes to at least one person, that is not a failure. That is not proof you never really forgave at all. It is information. It is the wound still asking for the medicine it was actually offered. The door Ripperger described, still slightly open, waiting for the one motion that actually closes it. Not another sentence, but the slow, repeated, often unglamorous act of releasing the debt again and again, every time the body brings the old ledger back out. I think often of St. Francis de Sales here, another voice in this same tradition, who spent a good part of his ministry counseling ordinary married people rather than monks in a monastery, which was unusual for his era. He wrote that gentleness toward those who wrong us has to be renewed the way a candle has to be relit, not lit once and expected to burn forever on its own. That image has stayed with me because it removes the shame from the whole equation. Nobody expects a candle to stay lit for 30 years without anyone tending it. And yet we expect exactly that from a single sentence of forgiveness spoken once, years ago, in a kitchen or a car or a hospital waiting room. As if saying it once should mean the flame never needs tending again. It does need tending. Every single time the old resentment flickers back up, that is not proof the first forgiveness failed. It's the candle asking to be relit. Again, as many times as it takes. Take this with you tonight. Forgiveness that only lives in your mouth is a promise your body hasn't signed yet, and a marriage, or any relationship, can survive a great deal. It has a much harder time surviving a debt that everyone agrees is closed on paper while it quietly keeps compounding underneath. There is one more place I think about often where this exact principle applies, and it's not a marriage at all. It's the people we've lost, because the same unfinished business, the same unresolved grudge, the same debt that was never truly released doesn't only exist between the living. Some of you are carrying exactly this kind of unfinished forgiveness towards someone who has already passed away. A parent, a spouse, a friend who died before the two of you ever fully closed that door. And unlike a living marriage, you don't get the chance to sit across the table from them and try again. That is precisely why the Church has always taught that our connection to souls who have gone before us does not simply end at the grave. It's the entire foundation behind the practice of praying for the dead, and it's the reason I point people towards something called purgatory rescue. 30 days of structured prayer offered on behalf of someone who has passed, a concrete way of finally closing a door that reconciliation in person can no longer close. If there's someone you lost before, that debt between you was ever actually released, not just spoken, but released. That is one path the Church offers for finishing what was left unfinished. I think about Margaret sometimes, and whether every debt between us in 38 years was ever fully released rather than just spoken kindly in the moment. I'll never get a kitchen conversation with her again to check. That's part of why this particular letter of Padre Pio struck me as hard as it did. It wasn't academic. It was personal, the way the best warnings always are. There's a specific memory that surfaced while I was writing this, one I hadn't thought about in years. About 4 months after we buried her, I was cleaning out a drawer in the bedroom dresser, the kind of task you put off as long as you can. and I found a folded note in her handwriting. Undated, tucked behind some old photographs. It wasn't addressed to me. It read like something she'd written to herself, working through an old argument between us. One I barely remembered by that point. A few lines about still feeling something she couldn't quite name whenever the subject came up, even though, in her words, I told him it was fine years ago. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, holding that piece of paper. Not because it accused me of anything, because it confirmed, in her own hand, exactly the pattern I'm describing to you tonight. A wound that had been declared closed out loud and was still, quietly, being processed in private, right up until she didn't have any more years left to finish processing it. I don't share that to make you feel sorry for me. I share it because I wish I had known. While she was still standing in that kitchen, what I know now, I would have asked a different question than, "Are you okay?" I would have asked what her body still needed, not what her words had already given me. I want to say one more thing before we close, about why I keep making these videos at all, week after week, digging through letters that are, frankly, not easy reading. There's very little reward in this kind of work, in the way the world usually measures reward. But if a video like this helped you see something in your own marriage, your own family, your own heart that you hadn't let yourself see clearly before, that's the whole reason I do this. If you'd like to support that work directly, there's a super thanks option right on this video, and I want to be clear about what that actually is. It's not a donation to a stranger. It's you telling me that digging through a dead friar's correspondence at my kitchen table at 70 years old, looking for the parts that got left out of the sanitized version, is worth something to you. You're not just a viewer of this channel. You're part of the reason I keep opening these letters instead of leaving them closed on a shelf somewhere. Before you go, I want to hear from you, honestly, in the comments. Was there a moment in your own life, with a spouse, a parent, anyone, where you said, "I forgive you" out loud and meant it, and only realized much later that your body had never actually caught up to the words? I'm not asking you to air anyone's business publicly. Just tell me if you recognized that gap tonight, the one between the mouth and the heart. I read every comment on these videos, and I think you'd be surprised how many people are carrying exactly the same unfinished door you are. And if you're married, or you love someone you've been quietly keeping score against, I'd ask you to do one more thing after you close this video. Not a grand gesture. Just notice the next time they reach for you, whether anything in you still pulls back before you decide it should. That single moment of noticing is usually where the real work actually begins. Not in a dramatic reconciliation scene, but in catching your own body in the act, gently, without judgment, and choosing, again, to open the hand a little further than it wants to open on its own. Remember what I told you at the beginning. The mouth can absolve a debt while the heart continues to collect on it. Say the words if you need to say them, but don't stop there. The body is still listening for the rest.